With Minoan Crete, the apogee of which extends from about 2500 BC down to about 1450 BC when Crete was conquered by the Mycenaeans, and its high period technically really extends from the rebuilding of the palaces after an earthquake destroys the palaces there 1750. The palaces are rebuilt about 1700, and that's the great high famous period of the palaces of Knossos and Mallia and Zakros and so forth. All of this dates from right in there. But with Minoan Crete, we are now entering upon a new stage of history. It is the stage at which the West's first appearance of the Wonder Child begins to make its appearance and begins to come into being. Now, Anne Baring, in her book on the history of the goddess, writes about Crete. She says, and I'll quote her here, she says, "As Gimbutas has shown, Crete was the direct inheritor of the Neolithic culture of old Europe. The goddess flanked by lions, the griffins painted on the walls of the throne room at Knossos, the pillared shrines, bull's horns, and the serpents all proclaim the signature of the older Neolithic mother goddess." That's what she writes, and yet nothing could be further from the truth, because for while it is true that iconographically speaking, Crete does continue many of the motifs and symbols that we're familiar with from the days of the earliest Neolithic at Muribet, for example, bull's horns buried in the walls, or Çatalhöyük, where we find double axes, butterflies, bees, and goddesses. With Crete, we're in a very different world that has an altogether different spirit from the dark and dreary world of the ancient Neolithic. And I think then that to really grasp what is going on in Crete, what a novelty the place really was, it's instructive to compare it and contrast it with Çatalhöyük. With Çatalhöyük, we were in the presence of a world sunken down into the underworld, held firmly in the choking grasp of the ancestors. The walls were full of morbid images of vultures eating people's heads, fat, plump mother goddesses with heavy, suffocating bodies that exude absolutely no odor of sexual intoxication whatsoever, skulls laid out on the floors everywhere, dark, dank interiors that resemble caves more than habitations, with animals coming at you from the astral plane through the walls. It's a grim, joyless place filled with morbid images and the stern, frowning countenances of forbidding ancestors and heavy menopausal old women tyrannizing of the men. There is, in short, no sexual energy in any of the artwork or imagery of Çatalhöyük. With Crete, though, all of this grim Neolithic imagery has vanished like the bad dream that it really was. The world of Crete is a sunny, joyful place filled with laughter, the young, and intense sexuality. There are no old people depicted anywhere in the artwork of Crete. We have arrived here at the birth of the Wonder Child, the primary imago of Western civilization from here on out. The men are long and slender, with long curly hair, and they're young and virile, mostly naked, and wearing only the cod pieces, which Sir Arthur Evans thought might have come from Libya. The Cretan goddesses are always pictured as young women, and they could not form a more striking contrast with the fat, plump, suffocating old women of Çatalhöyük. The Cretan goddesses are lithe, slim, and nearly nude. Their breasts are exposed, as though in constant reminder of their temptation. Their dresses are gay and beautiful, and their visages are made up with rouge and other colors. They're obviously meant to be constantly erotically stimulating to the eye, and the men are in competition with each other for the favors of these women, and they're inspired to wondrous acrobatic feats during the great bull games, where they're shown leaping and jumping over the bodies of the raging bulls. Death is not a presence here. Nowhere do we find the ancestors. Whereas the Çatalhöyükians buried the dead under the beds they slept on, the Cretans buried their dead in cemeteries kept well away from any city limits. Now, the Cretans are the first in the West to stop the practice of burying the dead under the floors of their houses. In fact, when they migrate over, probably from Asia Minor, they leave that custom behind. They start by putting the dead in separate cemeteries. And the main cemetery at Knossos was located 600 meters to the south of the city, well away from the goings-on of the city. So the dead have been cleared thoroughly out of the domus. The imagery of Crete is all light and life, whereas the imagery of Çatalhöyük is of visions of the afterlife and the astral plane, of mythical bulls and monstrous vultures, snarling leopards. The imagery of Cretan art is of the actual physical daylight world itself. It is in the art of Crete for the first time that the Western mind is shown beginning to awaken to the real world. For Cretan art is filled with landscape paintings and still lifes. We find images of mountains with lilies growing on them. Rooms are lined at the top with lintels of painted partridges and hoopoes. Walls and floors of playfully sporting dolphins swimming on them. Images of plants, of poppies and lilies and roses and tulips adorn all the walls. It is a vision of this world, here and now, not the afterlife. And I think at Crete then, the mind is beginning to awaken to the realm of waking consciousness, and it's beginning to shed the dream, the nightmare of the Chthonic cult of the dead and the earth spirits of the Neolithic that have been left thoroughly behind here. It's interesting that nowhere in the imagery of Crete do we find images of old people. And in fact, even the men who are represented on the walls that are painted on the art of Crete do not even have beards. This is in contrast with the Mycenaean men who in their Tolos graves, such as on the gold foil masks, actually still have beards. And for the Mycenaeans, on the other hand, the Mycenaeans held on to the cult of the dead for a lot longer and had a much stronger axial orientation to the cult of the dead. They had these shaft graves that were preceded, that came into being about the same time as the so-called Tolos tombs on Mycenae. And the Cretans were they were very technologically precocious. And in fact, the myth of Daedalus, it's said in the myth that he actually is an Athenian, but I think that may be an attempt on the part of the Athenians to own him. He really personifies the great Cretan artist, master craftsman, because the Mycenaeans looked up to and admired the Cretans for their technological abilities, for the layout and design of their cities, and they actually brought them over from across the water to help them, after they conquered them in 1450 BC, to help them build their Tolos structures. And whereas also in contrast with the Minoans, the Mycenaeans still continued burying their dead within the palace precincts. They didn't have cities, but they had these big fortress palaces, such as at Pylos and Mycenae and Tiryns, and they buried the dead on the inside of these palaces. So they still had a very strong relationship with the cult of the revered dead. Now, if we look at one of their graves here, the so-called grave circle A, that's composed of 6 shaft graves. This isn't a Tolos tomb, but a shaft grave. We find 19 people in all buried in these shaft graves, but it's the funerary gifts in these graves that take one's breath away. There are gold masks laid over the faces of the dead, gold signet rings with scenes of human combat and the hunt, a gold lion's head rhyton, gold panels to decorate a wooden box, gold cups and gold jewelry of every description, earrings, diadems, pendants, armbands, leg bands, beads, cut-out ornaments sewn to the garments of the dead. Other dazzling gifts include ornate ceremonial daggers decorated with scenes of the hunt or lions, or with river scenes, Nilotic or river life scenes made in a technique thought to be derived from Syria, and a bull's head rhyton made of silver with nostrils, horns, and ornamental rosette of gold. Lastly, there were the many instruments of war, many great bronze swords over 3 feet long of both slashing and thrusting varieties. So the Iron Age has not yet come in here with the Mycenaeans. Now, note that this implies all of these tools that are buried with the dead here at Mycenae implies a conception of the afterlife and the destiny of the dead that is completely at odds with what we find in Homer, where the underworld visited by Odysseus is a realm full of twittering, ineffectual shades in a dark and dreary underworld that is very similar to that of the Sumerians. The grave implements, on the other hand, that the Mycenaeans put in with their revered dead imply that the dead will both need and use them in the afterlife, and that they therefore could not have been for the Mycenaeans mere twittering, ineffectual shades the way Homer encounters them, or the way Homer has them in the Odyssey. So we can infer then that for the Mycenaean underworld, the underworld was not yet a dreary place, and the dead were still effective presences both there and in the lives of the living. Now, it's the custom really of the burning of the dead that was introduced later after the Mycenaeans by the Dorians. There's a massive dark age. The Trojan War occurs about 1200 BC. There's a major catastrophe of some sort that wipes out all the civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Hittites go down, the Trojans go down, the Mycenaeans go down. The Minoans had long since been conquered by the Mycenaeans. Sea peoples are on the move as in a new Völkerwanderung. They're wandering all over the place. They're crashing into Egypt under the reign of Ramses III. The Egyptians barely managed to keep their heads above water in all of this chaos. And along come the Dorians in all of this, and they bring with them, most likely from Asia Minor, the custom of burning the body. And this, the Athenians are the first who begin to pick up the practice of burning the dead. In about 1190 or about 1100, right about 1100 BC, they pick up the practice, and they've inherited it from the Dorians of burning the dead. Now, as Erwin Rode remarks in his book on Psyche, once the body is destroyed by fire, then the psyche is relegated to Hades, and it cannot return. No return to this earth is permitted to it, and not a breath of this world can penetrate to it there. It cannot even return in thought, as Rhoda remarks. Indeed, it no longer thinks at all and knows nothing of the world beyond. The living also forget one so completely cut off from themselves. So with the burning of the dead, the psyche, according to Rhoda, can no longer even return to the body. And so the reverence for the dead that we find Homer has in the Iliad, the great festival games that take place at the end at the funeral of Patroclus, and which Rhoda says are the ultimate origins of the Olympic Games that come into being in 776 BC in and near Athens. We have a one-time only celebration of the dead that fades just like the embers of a fire very quickly, whereas for the Mycenaeans, in their Tolos tombs, they had conduits, and the tombs were in such a way, they were designed like some of the Egyptian tombs in such a way that the living could constantly go back into them and pour offerings to the dead and leave libations to the dead on a basis all throughout the year, so that the dead were constantly interacted with there. But once you have the burning of the dead, the body is gone, and you have the funeral games once and once only, the dead are wiped clean from the slate, from memory. And of course, this begins to clear the slate in the West for the advent and emergence of the wonder child. This weakening in the cult of the dead that Erwin Rhoda pointed out was essential for the emergence of the great creative singularity that begins to come into being with the Athenians. Now, the Athenians are the first to begin creating. They start moving they create a cemetery right around 1190, and they start moving the dead out of the city. They create a separate keramikos, the so-called keramikos cemetery, at which a new style of pottery called the proto-geometric pottery first appears. That appears there about 1050 BC. And they start burning the dead. They bring in the practice of cremation about 1100, and they start putting the ashes of the dead inside of these giant vases that are called amphorae, and they put them out in the cemetery. Prior to that, they had been burying the dead on the inside of the city, just the way the Mycenaeans had been doing. But this separation was absolutely crucial that took place here. So then they're pushing the dead out of the city, which, as we have seen time and time again throughout history, indicates a clearing of the space for the domus of the living. This becomes one of the crucial turning points in the history of the West, because the adoption of cremation was preceded by moving the dead out of the city into the Keramikos cemetery, is of itself of highest significance. Because after it, this indicates that the Athenians are open to the new, and they start picking up new technologies, like we find the first iron sword. The Dorians bring along with them into Greece the practice of iron working, and iron, as Fernand Braudel remarks in his work on the history of the Mediterranean, is very cheap. It was much cheaper and easier to get than either tin or bronze, and its popularity comes in here out of this sort of gritty dark age as a way of upstaging the great periods of the civilizations before this. So we get the first iron swords starting to appear in these graves, these proto-geometric vases, which eventually give rise to the geometric amphorae, and the vases get larger and larger and larger with the ashes of the dead, the no longer revered dead, tossed into them. And the Athenians start turning towards new little interesting gadgets like these fibulae that are used to hold together the robes. That's a new innovation. And all this new stuff starts coming into being that begins to pave the way. We get geometric pottery developing around 900. And all of this begins to pave the way for the coming in the 8th century of a whole series of innovations. Now, in the 8th century, at the Keramikos cemetery, the amphorae with their long necks and the craters with no necks were used for men, and the one with the long necks were used for women. They were also used for mixing wine and water and so forth. But in the 8th century, we start getting a whole series of innovations that start coming into being here. The 8th century is simultaneously, it's a pivotal point for the Greeks because they're looking both backwards and forwards. The innovations are the first Olympic Games, 776 BC. Homer lives at this time. He now is doing the first writing, and so the alphabet is coming into being here with the Greeks, and they are writing down the first epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Dipylon pottery, which is a transformation of the right geometric style, also comes into being. And all of this stuff is going on, including a revised and revived cult of the heroes in which temporarily the cult of the revised dead, the cult of the revered dead, begins to make a comeback in Athens, and they start reburying the dead in terms of inhumation, of putting them whole into the graves along with their weapons and implements, as though they were deliberately hearkening back to the age of the Mycenaeans. And I think that the 8th century was an age of a kind of rear view mirror effect, as McLuhan would call it. They're looking back and idealizing the age of the Mycenaeans the way we did with the creation of the Western as a genre, looking back into the 19th century as we move forward into the industrial world. Homer was doing something similar in the creation of the Iliad. He is looking backward at the great age of the Mycenaean warriors, and he's idealizing it in a certain sense. He's glorifying it, but yet this is an age, he's glorifying it and idealizing it, but yet he's beginning to introduce, he's using the Iliad as an epic, as a vehicle to introduce something new, a new character with a new attitude that differs from that of the Mycenaean warriors and their old ways and old traditions, namely Achilles. Achilles represents something different in the Iliad. Achilles, as Carolyn Alexander has remarked in her book, The War That Killed Achilles, really is in many respects a late addition to the epic and may have been actually invented by Homer himself. He's absent for most of the action in the epic. He doesn't appear in most of it, which indicates that he probably wasn't essential to the plot originally. And he has a kind of fairy tale lifestyle about him. He's raised by Chiron, raised by centaurs. His mother dips him into the river Styx to make him invulnerable except for his heel. And he has this fairy tale aspect about him that the other characters don't have, that link him with a folkloristic type of hero. But now Achilles represents, he's the youngest of all the warriors, and he really is the first appearance of the Wonder Child as a concrete apparition. And his conflict with Agamemnon over the girl Briseis, as the epic opens up, is really a conflict against of the new traditions that are coming into being, the new self-assertion. He really is an avatar of the mind of Athens in the 8th century, of its newfound self-assertion coming into being in the age of wonders that it's about to inaugurate with the 5th century invention of democracy, the rise of the polis, and the invention of philosophy and linear thinking and mathematics and all of this stuff that's coming up on the horizon, all of these new transformations. Achilles is the beginnings of all of this. He represents the earliest horizon of the appearance of all of this. One of the central archetypes that he plugs into, of course, that's one of the main archetypes of Greek mythology, is the archetype of the younger son overthrowing the father. Because it was prophesied of his mother that his mother Thetis, who was a goddess, who would, whatever her offspring would be, he would be so strong that he would overthrow his father. So this is why Zeus kept well away from her. But notice that this casts Agamemnon in a subtle way as the displaced father, which Achilles was born to overthrow. And Homer shows us in the first book how Agamemnon is a very weak king with poor judgment who makes one bad decision after the next. First, he refuses to return the priest Chryses' daughter Chryseis to him and brings down Apollo's plague on the troops as a result. Then he alienates Achilles by taking his war prize Briseis away from him. Then he strangely tests his troops by lying to them and telling them that he's ready to go home and forget about the war. And to his surprise, the troops run eagerly off to the boats. So he is portrayed by Homer as representing the old guard, the old Mycenaean ways that are simultaneously being glorified by Homer and yet also paid farewell to. Achilles really is also painted by Homer as the de facto leader of the troops. Achilles calls the troops to assembly, just as a real leader would. He thinks of the well-being and safety of the troops. He guarantees the safety of the seer Calchas. And it is Achilles' prayers which are heard and listened to by the gods, but they ignore Agamemnon's. For Achilles has prayed to his mother Thetis to go and intercede to Zeus on his behalf to make the war go badly for the Achaeans without his help. And Zeus agrees to do this, despite the resistance of his wife Hera. So Homer plugs Achilles into the myth of the displaced father, whether we think of Cronos castrating his father Uranus or of Zeus overthrowing Cronos. Achilles belongs to this tradition of the wonder child who now comes in to begin to usurp the ways of the old tradition. So he represents a total novelty, something that is totally new. Achilles is the future of Greek civilization, and his insolence and disrespect for the authority of his elders, Agamemnon, and also Nestor, represents the tradition of the questioning of those in power and authority by the Greeks themselves, who would be the founders of a tradition that would be critical of its forebears. This isn't a tradition in which one simply sits at the feet of the guru and blindly follows whatever he tells you to do. This is a tradition in which we criticize our masters and achieve ourselves, come to our own achievements precisely through that criticism. The novel achievements of the 5th century, democracy in art and sculpture, and the drama and lyric poetry, put the Mycenaean world to shame. So that's what they're poised on the threshold of doing. And this could only have happened once the Greeks let go of their reverence for the past and their elders and the cult of the dead. There are no old men depicted in Greek sculpture until the Hellenistic era, when the art is beginning to decline. And essentially, Achilles is the incarnation of the Kouros boy with arms straight down at the sides, that represents this the first figure really that represents the beginnings of Greek sculpture, and it indicates the influence of Egypt on Greek sculpture. Alexander the Great, of course, will later follow in his footsteps as the world's youngest conqueror, and it was, of course, no coincidence that the Iliad was Alexander's favorite work. So this is the world that we will leave off here. The Iliad as a rearview mirror work that, while Greek civilization is in the 8th century also leaving monarchy behind and moving on to an aristocratic age, Homer is looking back at the age that is receding, the Mycenaean age of the great warrior kings. That is precisely what is disappearing in the 8th century with the rise up now of the cavalry. The cavalry that's coming into being here displaces the kingly chariotry of the Mycenaean age. For the cavalry is associated with the aristocracy as the monarchy is falling away, just as the Mycenaean age is falling away. Just as the rise of the hoplite and phalanx formation will signal the decline of aristocracy and the beginnings of the rise of democracy in the generations coming after Homer. So Homer is standing right on the threshold between these two ages, in which the West is about to take the plunge into its massive period of one creation and innovation after the next. And I want to leave this series then right here with Homer, where we are poised. We've looked at the entire survey of the past, and we've seen how the cult of the revered dead retards technological development. Not that this is either necessarily a good or a bad thing, but that it retards the development, slows it down. And then in the West, the cult of the wonder child. And it may be that the primary reason why both the Minoans and the Greeks bring in the cult of the wonder child is because this is really the first civilization in history that is not a riverine civilization. That is to say, it isn't bound to one single geographical spot. It's a maritime civilization. It's really the Minoans are really the first maritime civilization in history. And the basis of a maritime civilization is that you're constantly moving around, coming into contact with new peoples, exactly as in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, or as in the Sinbad tales later of the Arabs. You're constantly coming into contact with new lands, new peoples, new ideas, and so you're constantly being stimulated, and it may be that this constant contact with new peoples and their different ways is what led to the Greeks' predisposition toward openness and novelty and change, and toward choosing the wonder child over the ways of the elders.